You are live now.
Good morning. Oh,
Yep, you need a mic.
just talking away with no mic on. Okay. Good morning. So it is Sunday morning, June 21st, 2026. Father's Day here at Unity of Springfield.
And it's also the first day of summer.
It is the first day of summer. It's the solstice. So this morning, we're going to talk a little bit about metaphysical interpretation of the Bible, and that is one of the differences between Unity practice and other places of worship that you may attend. And so we're going to talk about what is metaphysical interpretation of the Bible, and then some of the ways in which we interpret different symbols and names and things like that. So the first thing is that the word metaphysical means beyond the physical. And Unity teaches that Scripture contains multiple levels of meaning. So we can have the historical meaning, the moral meaning, the symbolic meaning, and the metaphysical meaning. And there's other lenses that you can also look at things through, but we're going to talk about these for this morning, because if we got it to the whole list, it's not a 45-minute to an hour discussion. It's a lot longer than that. And so, according to Charles Fillmore, every character, place, and event in Scripture represents aspects of consciousness and the soul's journey towards spiritual awakening. Yeah.
I know you weren't going to
Oh,
be.
it's right there.
I know you're doing these ones here, but for me, the individual life experience meaning, because I always saw Job and I always hated it. It was like, God is just what a crappy thing God is, sitting betting, and if you're a good person, he's just gonna play games to impress the devil, I just hated Job, and they're just torturing this guy.
Too much echoing.
And now, through life, I looked at it and it's like, oh my gosh, this is totally about someone who got their focus off of what they really wanted, and life went down the tube, and then it shows exactly through his journey how you get back on track again. And it was like totally because of what I had changed.
Yes.
How I had changed.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so Unity has, Unity's foundational assumptions about Scripture have these are some of the key principles. That the Bible describes the evolution of consciousness, and so the Bible can be viewed as humanity's unfolding awareness of God. That every person contains divine potential, so the Christ is not limited just to Jesus, but is the divine nature present within every person. And that Scripture speaks to our inner experience. So biblical stories, and this is what you're talking about, Wendy, that biblical stories describe experiences happening within us now, and that Unity teaches that Scripture can be understood on multiple levels simultaneously. So one level doesn't necessarily invalidate another, and instead each layer reveals additional wisdom and insight. So Charles Fillmore often described the Bible as a spiritual textbook whose deepest truths are revealed as our consciousness expands. Did you have a question? Looks like you were having had a thought over there. And so that's exactly what you were referencing, Wendy. Like as our consciousness expands and we can look to these stories and we see them as how does this relate to me today now in my journey, and and then it has more meaning than simply thinking about it as something historical. But there is value in looking at the historical lens. So the historical approach seeks to understand the events, people, cultures, and circumstances surrounding a biblical text. And so the questions that the historical perspective asks is, who wrote this passage? When was it written? What was happening in society at that time? And what would the original audience have understood about this story? And I think that's been one of the really interesting things as I've gone through classes and learned more, is really having a deeper understanding of that historical context on top of the metaphysical interpretation. It changes the way you interpret the story based on what you know about the historical context. And so historical, so for an example, the Exodus, the historical interpretation is going to ask, did a group of Hebrew people actually leave Egypt? What was life like under Egyptian rule, and what was it like leaving that rule? How did this event shape the identity of Israel? Those are the types of things, because we're actually focused on the events and the historical context. And so there's value in that because it helps us to understand cultural customs of the time, political realities, what the geographic setting was like, and the challenges that were being faced within the stories. So, and again, we often ask the question in a historical study, what did this mean to them? What would this have meant to people? And that one of the biggest ones in one of my classes is we were talking about the story of Lazarus. And so that there's a part, anyway, you guys, most of you probably know the story of Lazarus and Jesus raising Lazarus. And that story is one that, like, so he raised him, and I've heard that as growing up. But like when you understand the historical perspective of that story, one of my instructors was talking about, so the belief at the time was that someone could be raised from the dead within 3 days. And, you know, many speculate that may have been due to like some people not being fully dead that they thought were fully dead and they rallied. But so there was this standing belief that 3 days, like that's why you had to wait for 3 days, because that after 3 days you were truly gone. And that was the custom of the time and the belief of the time. And so the reason the story of Lazarus is so important is because they were imploring Jesus to get there within that 3 days to raise him, and he didn't get there within 3 days. And so he actually raised Lazarus from the dead past the 3 days, and that's why it was a miracle to the people. And I never, like, I mean, to me, raising someone from the dead on any day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is the miracle. But for that story, that is like one of the key points, is that it was past 3 days, and the belief at the time was that it couldn't be done past 3 days. And that's why even as after he had passed, they were still encouraging Jesus to get there faster, because he had 3 days. He was on time frame. He had 3 days to get there. So just interesting stuff like that comes out of our look at the historical interpretation. Yeah, Dawn, the mic's right there in front of you.
Well,
It strikes me that a lot of what Jesus said was I don't think he expected anybody, very many people, to believe what he was saying, because it was so far out. Love your enemies and all that sort of thing. I think he was planting seeds, historical seeds that would succeed him, that one day would begin to get the drift of what he was saying. That it is the truth, and this is what you shoot at. But he didn't. I don't think he expected him to fully realize the import of what he was saying.
Mm.
And that I think a free will preacher would say that about Lazarus that he was starting to smell before the before Jesus raised him from the dead, and people people thought that that was
What do you mean?
almost impossible for anybody to raise somebody from the dead after they started smelling that they was dead. So that's another story in the Bible that is hard to believe.
Yes. So the next lens is the moral interpretation. And so when we look at the moral level, we're seeking the ethical guidelines or the practical life lessons. So the questions that we get from the moral interpretation are what behavior is being encouraged, what behaviors are being discouraged, what value is being taught here, and how should this influence my actions. And so an example of that is, the story of the Good Samaritan. So the literal story is a story about a traveler who's been beaten and left for dead. The moral lesson is to show compassion to others, especially those who are different from you. And the moral teaching is to love your neighbor through action, not merely belief. And the value of this moral level of interpretation is helping us to answer, how should I live? What should my actions look like? And this is where we often form the basis of character development and ethical behavior through the interpretation of the stories. Yeah. Oh, Brenda, can you hand me that?
That can sure get messed up though, because we think that we're teaching an absolute moral truth. And I have experienced and heard of a lot of people getting a moral truth from something like when the angels, when the men are lusting after the angels, and the guy just sends the daughters out. I'll send the daughter. It's like, and a moral truth that was got from that is women just aren't as important as men. Women don't mean anything. So I'm just saying that we can get some really screwed up moral truths from
Yes.
those two.
Based on the interpretation, right? Like if that's the only thing you're looking at it very literally for what is the lesson. Absolutely. Yes. Then if we look at the symbolic interpretation, so this is recognizing that many biblical images point themselves beyond themselves to universal spiritual realities. And the questions we're asking here are, what might this object represent? What larger truth is being communicated here? What universal experience is being illustrated? And unlike the moral interpretation, symbolic interpretation is focused less on behavior and more on the meaning of things. And so an example would be light. Throughout scripture, we see references to light, and we see that symbolizing things like wisdom, understanding, divine presence, and spiritual awakening. So when Jesus says, I am the light of the world, the symbolic interpretation asks, what does light represent in human experience? Another example is water. So we see water symbolizing consciousness, cleansing, spiritual life, emotional flow. And it often appears in things like baptisms and the wells and the rivers and the rain. And under the symbolic level, we're looking at what universal truth is this image trying to communicate. And symbols are allowing spiritual truths to go beyond culture, language, and time. So unity embraces all three levels, but then moves a step deeper into the metaphysical. Yeah, Wendy.
Just when you're talking about symbolic, our language itself is symbolic. They're just symbols, the words. And I remember there was one time my first husband. There was some scripture in the Bible that said they all did something save one, and to me that's really simple. Only one of them didn't do it, but he was just like, no. One of them was saved, and all of the rest of them did that thing. So that thing was wrong because only one got saved who didn't do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and that gets into the actual like language and words,
Which are all
right?
symbols.
Which are symbols, but we don't necessarily, like, most people would have to think about that for a second when you say all words are symbols. Wait a minute, no. But it's true. And I was listening to NPR the other day, and they had someone on that was talking about like keeping up with the dictionary and how the dictionary is a fluid thing, because we as humans, we change the meaning of the symbols as we go along. We change the meanings of words. And so that's why we have, different versions of dictionaries, and they have different standards as to how long something has to be in the vernacular before it gets put into the dictionary. And that's why you have things like the Urban Dictionary and the Slang Dictionary and all of these things, because some of them, it's recognized that it's probably a fleeting, it could be a fleeting word that will just fall out of, common speech altogether, or the definition is bound to change again. And so there's certain dictionaries that have a standard that it has to be common use for X number of years before it gets included. And if it's not there yet, then it goes in one of these peripheral dictionaries. Yeah.
Nowadays that everybody is using online version of a dictionary instead of the hard copy book version. Most people use this Wikipedia, which is constantly changing as time goes on.
Yeah. And that's what we've even created these places where we can explain the changing definitions and the changing use. There was a time where the dictionary was the dictionary and none of these other things existed. You had to go, I know for me, like I had to go to the school library. And I remember the giant dictionary on the big podium, and you could like flip all the pages and find all the words. And then we had like the smaller versions in the classrooms and things. But there was like, we thought of the dictionary in the library that was like giant. That was the dictionary. If you needed something, yeah, go on.
This reminds me of the word gay. As I grew up, that's something different than it means today. A totally different word, totally different context, a totally different connotations. Everything's different. It's just another example of how fluid this thing is.
Yes, and that's where we look at, when we're looking at metaphysical interpretation, we want to look at all the different layers, because we need to know historically, what did that terminology mean at the time that this story was written? Because maybe it's different now. If you want you want to be around little language symbol creators, hang around middle school kids these days. That seems to be where all the like middle school, junior high, that's where all the 6, 7, and dog water, and I don't know, all the
Hasn't
different
it
things.
always been that way?
Probably so. That's when the little creative brains are just throwing out all of these new words and different ways to use language and symbols. So Unity embraces all 3 levels, but then we move into that metaphysical interpretation. So we're looking at the historical, so a story happened. We're looking at the moral, so there's a lesson to be taught here, something for us to learn. We're looking at the symbolic, so images represent spiritual realities. And then the metaphysical, the entire story is happening within consciousness right now. And how does that apply? And so an example could be looking at the story of David and Goliath. So if you look historically, you're saying, okay, a battle occurred. When you go into the moral part, most people would agree that one of the lessons to be taught from that story is to be courageous, to have faith and be courageous. Something symbolic out of that is faith overcomes fear. And then going to the metaphysical, the Christ within me is overcoming the giant of limitation in my own consciousness right now. And so the metaphysical level asks us, again, how is this story unfolding within me today? What does it mean to me in my now experience? And that means that as we are all, there are themes and there are perspectives that many reading the same story would take away. There's interpretations that do that. But there's also this personal level of, as we are each individual expressions, as we look to these stories and interpret them for what is happening in our journey, in our story, in our expression right now, that could be different for each one of us. We could all read the same story and have a slightly different metaphysical interpretation based on how it's hitting within our consciousness in this now moment. Yeah.
So I was listening to a thing on tape that was talking about studying biblically, and one of the things that it said is, it said historically a lot of people at a certain point were not educated. They didn't read books. There weren't a lot of books and all that. So things were told in stories. Story was a big way to pass information and to teach and just to share time. And many of the stories were made up stories to get a point across, which is saying, I was in a Mennonite service once, and the guy talked about a farmer in the field and did this and this. I doubt there really was a farmer in the field. He was using that. So that's one of the things when we have to say everything in the Bible, those people literally lived, literally did that. Odds are most of them weren't, because that's how they communicated, was through stories.
Yeah. And that's why, if we look to, here at Unity, we tend to focus in on the teachings of Jesus and what was he saying and how was he interacting with the world. And Jesus used parables often. He was telling stories that he was hoping would resonate and stick with people far longer than the time that he had with them. And that is, part of our human brain. We like to tell stories. We like to fill in stories. And so that is a powerful method for passing on information. I was just reminded the other day, we were talking about technologies, and we were talking about AI, and people, were saying, oh, there's right now seems to be pretty divided camps. There's, the one camp that like AI is the future and let's dive head first. And then another camp that's like AI is the end of all intelligence and it's the end of us. And someone in the group was like, well, at one point, Socrates was saying that paper and the written word would be the end of society because it was the tradition of storytelling, and that's how information was passed on, and it was ingrained in us to be storytellers. And his worry was that as the stories started getting written down, they wouldn't be as impactful, or people wouldn't read them, people would stop telling the stories. It was going to be the end of society as we know it. And first, in some part, he was correct, but it's just interesting how even the way we tell stories or convey stories changes over time as well. Did I see another?
You cannot even do a Google search anymore without going through AI.
Yeah.
It is one of the, I hate using Google now because of that, but
Somebody said the other day that if you type your search and then do like a comma minus AI or without AI, it won't do that. Someone told me. I haven't tried it yet.
Well, I tried that, and it maybe worked one or two times, and then you got to do it all over again.
Yeah. We could get on a whole conversation about AI, but, but I won't. So this is why Unity often says that the Bible is not just a record of humanity's relationship with God, it's a map of the soul's journey toward awakening to its divine nature. And so I wanted to take a look at some of the metaphysical meanings. So if we look at metaphysical meaning of symbols, I don't know why it did that weird thing at the top. So water is consciousness and spiritual understanding. The desert could be spiritual testing and preparation. Mountains, higher awareness and spiritual realization. Light, divine understanding. Darkness, ignorance or limited awareness. Temple, the body and the soul. Egypt, bondage to limiting belief. Are any of those surprising to anyone, or is that about what you? Yep, pretty common. Yeah.
The only thing is with, I know I've done dream interpretation, and there's a list of what everything means, but my list doesn't match theirs almost at all. When I dream about a husband, it's totally about control. But somebody who had never experienced controlling men might not have that same interpretation at all if they have that dream, if they think about it.
Is there such a thing?
And yeah, I'm just saying that some of the time what I do when I'm, instead of saying this is what their interpretation, I might look at what someone else's interpretation. But what I'll do is I'll just think, okay, I'll think the desert. One word. What does that mean to me? The desert, And then and I find it's much more helpful for me to do that myself. And if I'm really interested in finding something meaningful in a scriptural, in scriptures.
Sure, and that's that part of making it about your personal journey. Oh, okay.
Yes, with the metaphysical meanings and stuff like that. One thing I see is a lot of times, I agree that certain things have many layers of meanings. But a lot of people I've seen here, and I've been coming here for over 30 years, is that once something has a metaphysical meaning, a lot of people will automatically cancel out the literal meaning. And like the second one from the bottom, Egypt. Egypt is an ancient Middle East is something I've been digging into deep for the last 5 or 6 years. And in the past, I was told, oh, this was a made-up fairy tale, and now they're finding out, certain things actually did happen. And so I think that automatically canceling out the literal part, if when you recognize a different level, it doesn't, I get concerned about canceling out the literal part of certain things.
Yeah, and so that's why I think if you look at the Unity teachings or like the metaphysical class that I had to take as a core class, it's about putting it all together. So, and really kind of saying, can we truly get to a good metaphysical understanding if we don't also understand that historical context and all the things that went with that? And that, like any stories, there's often some factual, real layer of that, right? And then there may be some things that were embellished for entertainment value, or there may be some that were embellished to give the story more meaning or things like that. But there's always that like core. It came from somewhere. So even if it didn't happen exactly as this, it happened. There was situations that were close enough that it was important to the story for it to be in this space. But I hear what you're saying, because I think that some people, just based on their experience or where we're at in consciousness, like there are times when it's uncomfortable for some to go with like literal stories of the Bible. There's been church trauma, or there's other things that have people shying away, and so the metaphysical meaning, keeping it up at that level is sometimes more comfortable. But I agree, sometimes you might lose part of the meaning or part of the core message if you're so resistant to that historical truth within there. Yeah.
I'd say that we have to remember that if we look back, say, 200 years, what was being said about such things as we're here talking about, we're not even contemplating. Mm-hmm. So there is a slight, at least I perceive, a slight increase in the level of consciousness that is extant in the world, because we're thinking answering questions that weren't even asked 200 years ago. That's an encouraging feature of this whole movement of understanding that we're enjoying.
Yeah.
So not that long ago, when metaphysics, the George Metaphysics opened for me in 1989, and at that time, they talked about meditation, okay? And in the religion that I came from, or almost any religion that I was in, meditating was a door to evil, And when I went to my therapist discouraged meditation because they said it just created problems in people's lives. So definitely the time you live in, it has would. So if we wrote something at that time about meditation and someone read it later on, it wasn't going to be something that was helpful. But if you say, oh, meditation, therapists all talked about it. Yeah, don't do it.
That's interesting. Oh, So looking at some biblical characters. So Unity often interprets biblical characters as representing qualities within us. So you have Moses, awakening spiritual will that leads us out of limitation. Pharaohs representing ego, resistance, and attachment to old patterns. David, faith and courage. Goliath, fear and appearances. Mary, receptivity to divine ideas. And Jesus, the fully awakened Christ consciousness. And there's so many others. If we look at metaphysical meaning, Jesus's life as stages of spiritual development. So if you look at his life as that spiritual path, you see the birth as awakening to your divine identity, baptism as spiritual purification and commitment, temptation, choosing spirit over ego, healing ministry, restoring wholeness in our consciousness, crucifixion, releasing false beliefs and ego attachments, resurrection, rising into our higher awareness, and ascension, the complete realization of divine nature. And what we know in Unity is that these are not one-time events. These are things, you can have many births and crucifixions and resurrections and within your spiritual development journey.
Kind of curious about ascension. You gonna do that more than once?
I think you can have moments, yeah, like you can have glimmers of a complete realization of your divine nature, and then like I think many of us that have been studying New Thought and metaphysics might say that like you've had those moments where it was like you felt like your full spiritual self, and then like humanness.
But we're still here.
We're like we're still here. So like our humanness comes back. So like those would maybe be ascension moments when you're like, oh, I felt it. Like I was fully in the flow. I felt the connection. It was so strong. I remember watching a TED Talk, and I cannot remember the lady's name, but there was a woman who I believe was a physician or a scientist of some kind. But her talk, she had a stroke, I believe, and she had like an out of body experience. And she describes this moment of like looking down on her human body and feeling her soul expand to its full self, and thinking, I don't know that I'm ready to be that yet, but looking at her human body and thinking, there's no way to fit all of this back into that tiny package. And I just remember I've watched it several times. I have to find it and remember her name, because it's just so impactful to hear her talk about, and as she realized that she was coming back into her human body, having this moment of, it's not going to fit. Like this expansive thing, how in the world can it fit back into this human package? And that was just so powerful to me. And so like I would think that was an ascension moment of like a full, oh my goodness, I had no idea that my spirit was this big, or that this is like, I've never felt this level of connection before. But then coming back into human form, can't quite feel it as strongly, or there's, it's just different. And so ascension moment, and then back and maybe reliving it again and again.
Yeah. I think that's part of the ascension moment, is you can't come back and be and fit the same.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't have to be, I would do my grandmother's hair every week. I'd go over and do it and spend the night and then redo it. She had very long hair. And sitting doing her hair one day, and at this time, the only thing that I knew about God is he was maybe a little bit better than the devil, but not much, not much. So I wanted nothing to do with any of that. And I was doing her hair, and I went to a place that I could have stayed there for eternity and been happy. No idea what brought it on, no idea how long it was. Couldn't have been longer. I think my grandmother would have complained. But it felt like forever, and never was I the same after that. Never.
Yeah, it's that whole thing, like you can't unknow something, right? Like once you know it, once you feel it, you can't completely ever unknow it or unfeel it. That's beautiful.
Well, in 1988, I was in a car wreck, and my left femur was broke in 3 places. And when the doctor had me on the operating table and was preparing to put this rod in my leg, I was looking down and I said, that rod is not going to fit in there. And then I woke up a few minutes later and it was in there, and I don't know how they got it in there, but they managed to put it in there, and I walked around with it for 2.5 years before they went back in and took it back out. But that is, when you look down at your body and somebody is working on it, and you say, and you tell yourself, this is impossible, is, and after the fact, it's a miracle that you even remember any of
That's what we used to call getting too high.
And then there's metaphysical meanings to different relationships. So things like Father's divine mind, originating principles, creative aspect of being, children, new thoughts, manifestations, emerging states of consciousness. Bride, the soul preparing for union with divine truth. And so that's what I learned through my introductory class as the core classes of metaphysical interpretation, is there's so many different layers, and when you start putting them all together, you can even have the same story that you may look at different times in your consciousness, and you would interpret it differently because different things are going to pop out of that story. And so one of my instructors called it making it metaphysical soup. This was her method. And so she takes, and she said it's like making a stew. Like, so she takes the story and starts pulling out like the important themes, things, you know, the words, the relationships, all of the things that stand out. And then she takes those ingredients and goes to things like insane.
Mine's silent. It's still
Because,
did that.
yes,
Yeah, mine's on fire.
because it's Missouri and
They're gonna have to wait.
it's Missouri weather. So things that we use, so there's the revealing word, which is, mine's gonna go off twice, I guess. And so this is a dictionary of metaphysical terms. So if you haven't, probably many of us in the room have looked at one, but just a really cool thing when you're looking for any metaphysical meaning. And this is where you can take the story and go to this. And
I
get an
just
idea.
have a question that
Yeah.
I think we should at least know. Where should we go in this building? If
I
the
know, well,
sirens are going off?
Yes, the sirens are going off now.
What was the warning about?
Earlier they had
Tornado.
a tornado warning in
The recent
Lockwood.
one?
I looked
Yeah.
up where Lockwood is, and it's a little bit north of us. So it's
Okay, it's just a question of, during the Joplin tornado, I guarantee the people that were in the Unity Church are glad they went to someplace safe when the
We think the hallway would be.
Yes.
The church.
Yes, I think this back hallway would be our safest place with all the doors shut. And away from, like, in between the meditation garden and the bathroom. So yes, thank you, Wendy. So are we?
We thought we'd investigate.
Okay.
Oh, so another is gonna go outside.
Well,
Did you see a tornado?
So let's just go ahead. So basically, that we've got the revealing word where you can look up different words and terms, and then we've got the Metaphysical Bible Dictionary that you can look up more like biblical names and different things in there. And so those are really good resources to go to if you want to do some metaphysical interpretation of Scripture. And we're just going to go ahead and end our live stream here this morning so we can take shelter if we need to because the tornado siren